Let's go. The threats are: queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Here are the checks. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using rook to e6. Pawn takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. King to h8. Queen to h6, check. Next puzzle, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes rook. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is knight takes pawn. Pawn takes knight. Bishop takes pawn, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn. The checks are: queen takes pawn, check. Queen to e4, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Knight to d3, check. Knight to c2, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight to c2, check. King to d2. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to e2. Queen takes queen, check. Another puzzle. The threats are: rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are: rook to c3, check. Rook to d3, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is: rook to c3, check. King to h4. Rook takes pawn. Another one. Threats in puzzle position are: queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. Rook to g4, check. The puzzle is solved using bishop takes pawn, check. Rook takes bishop. Queen takes rook, check. Next puzzle. Here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is b6, f4, g4, f5, check. King to f6. King to f4. g3. King takes pawn. King takes pawn. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Answer to this puzzle is: queen takes bishop, check. Rook takes queen. Promotes to queen, check. Queen to g8. Rook to d8. Queen takes rook. Queen takes queen, check. Next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are: rook to g5, check. Rook to c4, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to g5, check. King to d6. King takes pawn. Let us go to the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to h3, check. Rook to g1, check. The best move in puzzle position is a2. Rook to a7. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Promotes to queen. Another puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is rook to f6. Queen to h3. Knight takes pawn, check. Rook takes knight. Queen takes rook, check. Queen to f1. Queen takes queen, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Pawn takes queen. Pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes knight. The checks are: queen to g4, check. Answer to this puzzle is: queen to g4, check. Queen to e6. Rook takes knight. Let's continue. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes queen. Checks in puzzle position are: rook takes pawn, check. Queen to d5, check. Queen to c6, check. The answer is queen to d5, check. King to f1. Rook takes pawn. Next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes queen, check. Queen takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are. Queen to h2, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes queen, check. h2, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. h2, check. King to h1. Queen takes queen. Next puzzle, the threats are. Queen takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Queen to e5, check. Queen to f4, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to f3, check. Queen to g2, check. Queen to e3, check. Queen to e1, check. Queen to d3, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Queen to e1, check. King to g2. Queen takes queen. Next puzzle, here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes rook. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. The checks are. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Next puzzle, puzzle position vulnerabilities are. King takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to a4, check. Solution to the puzzle is. h2. King to b5. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Promotes to queen. Another one, the threats are. Rook takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are. Rook to h5, check. The answer is. b7. Rook to b2. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Promotes to queen. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes queen. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to e1, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to e1, check. Rook takes rook. Queen takes queen. Next, the threats are. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Here are the checks. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to e5, check. Queen to e4, check. Queen to e3, check. Rook to e1, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Rook to e1, check. Bishop to e7. Queen takes pawn. One more, the threats are. Queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. The checks are. Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is. b6. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Next, threats in this position are. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to h1, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Rook to h1, check. King takes rook. Knight takes pawn, check. King to h2. Knight takes queen. Another one, threats in puzzle position are. Rook takes bishop, check. Rook takes rook. Here are the checks. Rook takes bishop, check. Rook to e8, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes bishop, check. King to f6. Rook takes bishop. One more, the threats are. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to d3, check. The best move in puzzle position is. Queen takes pawn, check. King to e1. Queen to g1, check. Queen to f1. Bishop takes pawn, check. One more, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook to h8, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook, check. The puzzle is solved using. Rook to h8, check. King takes rook. Rook takes rook, checkmate. Let's continue. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes queen. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are. Queen to h2, check. Queen to e3, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen takes queen. Knight takes queen. Bishop to e3, check. King to h2. Rook takes rook. Thank you for watching, please like and subscribe.